Greetings folks, and welcome to another 8/16/32-bit, and today it's another episode of Why It Failed, and as you all saw by looking at the thumbnail, we're talking about Sega's ill-fated 32X machine. Now, I'm going to go through a few things here. I'm going to go over the technical specifications of the machine, a little bit of history, a little bit about some of the games, and then I'll go into the reasons as to why I believe the 32X was basically a complete and utter flop. So, without further ado, let's just take a quick look at the 32X and its specifications first. So, for those unfamiliar, the 32X was an add-on for the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis as it was known in America, designed to act as a low-cost entry option into the new 32-bit generation, where you had the 3DO, the Jaguar, then you had the Saturn and the PlayStation. Now, obviously Sega had the Saturn coming out, so the 32X was seen as a bridge between the 16-bit Mega Drive generation and the 32-bit power of the Saturn. Now, when it comes to specifications, the 32X was reasonably well spec'd. It was powered by two SH32 RISC CPUs running at 23 MHz. Now, they're the same pair of processors that you actually get in the Saturn, but running at a substantially lower clock speed. The GPU provided in it boosted the Mega Drive's ability to display colours from a paltry 64 colours on screen or thereabouts to a whopping 32,000 colours, and it had the ability to handle 50,000 raw polygons per second, which was a significant step up from the Genesis and even the SVP. To help with all this extra power, the 32X contained 256k of system RAM, and that's 256k as in kilobytes, and 256k of video RAM. Now, there was also some sound hardware in there, which was a pulse wave modulation based system, which did boost the Sega Mega Drive's audio capabilities, but you could use the power of the 32X in conjunction with the Mega Drive CPU and audio processor, which is what a lot of games ultimately ended up doing. Now, the 32X was released in the US and Europe in November of 1994, where it was priced at $159.99 in the US and approximately £169.99 in the UK, and whatever the euro equivalent of that was at the time. It was released a month later in Japan, and unfortunately for the 32X, that was also the exact same time that the Saturn launched in Japan, so not the best move. But anyway, now the 32X sold 800,000 units of hardware in the approximately 12 months it was being sold as a viable commercial platform. Now, that sounds like a fair number for an add-on. However, by this point there were some 30 million Mega Drive and Genesis consoles out there in the wild, so as Atari were fond of saying, do the math. That's approximately 2.5% of all Mega Drive owners bought a 32X. Not a great number when you consider that the Mega CD, or Sega CD as it was known in America, which was also considered to be a relative flop, was owned by roughly 8 to 10% of all Mega Drive and Genesis owners. Now, initially, it sold 800,000 units, and initially it sold quite well. By the end of January 1995, Sega had sold roughly 600,000 units of the 32X, which was fairly good, but as we'll see, not good enough because demand did drop off quite rapidly. Now, in terms of games, it didn't have the best launch lineup. There were some good games available and there were some terrible games available. For every Virtua Racing Deluxe, there was, quite sadly, a Doom. It didn't even have a proper Sonic title. Instead, it had a spin-off in Knuckles Chaotix, which, whilst not a terrible game, wasn't really anything that couldn't have been achieved on a stock Mega Drive, apart from obviously the more colourful graphics. Now, the 32X did have some great games. As I've already mentioned, you had Virtua Racing Deluxe, which was superb, Star Wars Arcade, which to this day remains the only home conversion of this Sega Arcade Model 1 classic, and eventually towards the end of 1995 Virtua Fighter was released, which many people, myself included, actually feel is better than the Sega Saturn version, which accompanied the Saturn's launch a year earlier. There were some other quite interesting titles on there, such as Calibri, which was a kind of shoot 'em up where you played a hummingbird, and there were games like Dark Side, which actually showed some texture mapping off and was another, very similar to Star Wars Arcade in being a 3D space shooter. But realistically, a lot of the games that came out for the 32X were just filler. There's the infamous Cosmic Carnage, which was a truly terrible 2D fighting game that used sprite scaling and rotation and was just hideous to look at and play. And most of the rest of the software titles were just, forgettable. I mean, how many more 32X games can you name? Was there T-Mech? And that's about it. Not a huge number of games were released, most of them were terrible. Anyway, the system did lack these killer apps, and this does kind of lead in to one of the reasons I believe, and many others believe, that the 32X failed. First off, let's address the elephant in the room in the Sega Saturn. Sega Saturn overshadowed the 32X. It was much more powerful, yes, it was much more expensive at more than double the price, but when you put them side by side, you could see what you were getting for the money, and that's what gamers wanted. They didn't want a halfway step between the old school 2D rough 3D 16-bit machines and the shiny new all 3D texture mapped future. It just wasn't, the market wasn't really there for it. Sega were competing with themselves for sales, and ultimately a number of people that may have well bought the 32X ended up just holding on to the money and buying a Saturn or a PlayStation instead. Plus, by this point in their life cycle, Sega had done a fair bit of damage to their own brand in the West and in Japan with the release of the Mega CD, which was seen as a very expensive and ultimately unsuccessful add-on. And this was just another attempt at extending the life of a machine which by this point had been around since 1988. So it was trying to drag out the life of an already aging piece of hardware. And yeah, as I mentioned, it was software as well. On launch, had Virtua Fighter been one of the launch games, I think it may have seen a little bit more in terms of sales, and it might have had a bit more legs to the market. But from the launch titles, once you got past Star Wars Arcade and Virtua Racing, there wasn't anything to keep gamers interested really. As I said, there was Knuckles Chaotix, but that wasn't anything we hadn't already seen, it wasn't anything new. And Virtua Fighter, great as it was when it came out in late 95, was released at the same time as Virtua Fighter Remix for the Saturn, which showed just how much more powerful the Saturn really was compared to the 32X. Another problem that did hinder the 32X somewhat and did contribute to its failure was its insistence on relying on cartridges. by this point games were moving to CD because the whole shift to 3D meant games needed more storage because they were bigger and more ambitious, and cartridges were relatively low capacity and relatively high price. This is a great one to present to people who say these days that the $69.99 price point for games in dollars or pounds is a new thing and they were never like that in the past. Well, the suggested retail price of 32X titles was $69.95 or £69.99 in the UK, and that was way back in 1994-95. So the equivalent pricing there today is well over £100. Now, the 32X was a failure, a big failure, and as I said, the reasons are many. The Saturn, with Sega competing with itself, the fact that the market didn't want this halfway house between one generation and the next, and ultimately Sega didn't know what to do with it. They marketed it hard at release, and then thanks to a diktat from Japanese head office, basically abandoned it to focus on the Saturn. So they spent all this money developing a great piece of hardware that there was no market for. Realistically, what they probably would have been better off doing was the original plan for the SVP, which involved making it a lock-on cartridge like Sonic and Knuckles and selling the games at a lower cost to add into it. So you may have seen more SVP type games on the Mega Drive had they done that, and the 32X wouldn't have really been needed because they would have provided somewhat of that halfway house. Looking at the specs of the SVP and looking at how good Virtua Racing was on it, they could have certainly done a version of Virtua Fighter and probably Star Wars Arcade, and probably developed some other polygonal titles to go with it. Anyway, that's why I think the 32X failed. No market, bad marketing, competition from its own company, and just a lack of decent games. Now, if you want to add anything to the debate, please feel free to do so in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. If you really liked what you've seen, hit the subscribe button, ring that bell to be notified of new uploads. There are options to support me on Patreon and Ko-fi. If you wish, you'll see the links for those in the end card. And until the next episode, this is Rob from 81632bit saying so long.